for seniors. So I motioned the waitress over and I said, I noticed we received a discount for our breakfast. And she said, oh, yes, we do that for seniors. I said, well, how could you tell? And she just laughed a little bit and back. She said, I don't know how to answer that. A little later, and she turned and walked away. A little later, she came back to our table and she said, I thought you were high school seniors. And that made my day. Well, we meet here this morning to continue our celebration for what happened in the past. And at this point, Bernard's going to lead us in a verse of trust and obey. We know it from memory. I think if it comes up here on the screen, that's fine. But Bernard, would you lead us?
When we walk with the Lord
in the light of His word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. So again, welcome as we gather here this morning to continue our remembering and thinking back and hearing stories of the past. And today I suspect David will be able to tell us why 4 Amish church houses were built in 1881. So that clears that up once and for all. But before that, just some words in terms of legacy of the past, lasting legacy. The night was January 21, 1525. It was on that night when a group of young people met to study the Bible and to talk about and discuss and discern the future. Among that group was Felix Mons, George Blaurock, and Conrad Grable. And sometime during that evening, it is said that George Blaurock suddenly stood up and he said to Conrad Grable, I want to be baptized as a believer. And they went to the kitchen, got a dipper of water, and Grable baptized Blaurock. And then others in turn said, we also want to be baptized. This they did. And that single act was the most defining act, according to historians, of the Reformation for our past and our people. And they didn't need to guess that this was in direct defiance of the state church of Rome. And they also, in all likelihood, knew that consequences would follow for that act. And so, as time went on, the actions of the group there, which was a direct assault on the Roman state church. 2 years after that, also in January, in fact, I think January 5, 1525, Felix Mons had nearly 2 years since the event of January 1 or 21, 25. And during the ensuing 2 years, a lot has happened, and Felix Mons refused to recant, and he was put in a boat, taken out, and with his hands behind his knees, was thrown overboard in the cold Lamont River in Surrey, Switzerland. His mother stood on the bank calling out, "Bleib standhaft," remain steadfast. And very soon, almost like a flame started going through Zurich and other places, and it wasn't long till that flame engulfed other outlying areas. And soon, a executioner in one of the districts was said to have killed 300 Anabaptists. And he said, "What shall I do? The more I kill, the more they become." The Martyrs' Mirror, I think, lists some over 4,000 individuals who were Anabaptists and were killed during that period of time. So here we are today, and we think of a lasting legacy, and that what that means for our group. And we many the recipients of that act in January 25. So the questions we can ask is what this means for us today. In 2003, there was a reconciliation conference in Switzerland, and the theme of the conference was Heal Our Land. And over 1,000 people gathered on that day to discuss what happened and what they might do in terms of reconciliation. That group included the Reformed Church from Zurich and other places in Switzerland, as well as Amish and Mennonites from the United States. They had a 4-day conference from May 1 to 4 in that year. So the conference was asking the question, what happened and what can we do in terms of reconciliation? And one of the attenders said there's no statute on reconciliation, that could happen even now. In 2011, Vernon and I visited in Switzerland, at Zurich and other places, and we stayed with a couple in Barrettsville, Switzerland, close to the Mennonite, the Anabaptist cave that many of you know about. And I decided I would not raise the subject with our hosts at that point. But during our stay, one of the hosts said, "Do you know, we lived close to the cave. In fact, we visited the cave at that time. We didn't know much about what had happened." Well, one of the things that had taken place, there was a TV program in Switzerland, and the crew would send out a balloon, and wherever that balloon landed, they would go to the nearest house and ask for a story. So this particular occasion, the balloon landed right near a barn that happened to house Anabaptists who were in hiding. So they wanted a story about that. And for the first time in many, many years, that TV program was publicized across Switzerland. And for the first time, people became aware that something very tragic had happened in the past. And it revived their interest. And in the ensuing years, I'm not sure where the balloon happened and the conference on Heal Our Land, the timing of those, but they coincided nevertheless in some respect. So the story is told by Enos Martin, who attended that conference. He said, here we were, a gathering of more than 1,000 people, and 40 Reformed pastors in Switzerland washed feet of Amish and Mennonites at that gathering. So that's part of our past that we can remember, but also reflect on what that means for us today. There's no statute on reconciliation. But in reflecting the book of Revelation, what John saw, he said when he opened the seal, he saw the altar of the souls of those who have been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. And then in Corinthians, we read, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old is gone, the new has come. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave to us the ministry of reconciliation. Here we are, gathered again to reflect just a little bit on the past. Let us bow for prayer as we move forward. Thank you, God, for the day you have given, for its beauty, with the foliage a reminder of time passing. We thank you for this day. We thank you for the gift you gave to us many, many years ago. And we thank you for those who went before, overseas and here in our own community, in the Cassleman Valley. So we would pray for your direction today as we reflect and discuss. We pray for David as he presents and us as we listen to the presentation, that we would be able to gain some clarity about our own history here in the Casselman Valley, but also some newborn faith as we move forward into the future. So we give thanks in your name. Amen. So this brings us to the presentation by David. He needs very little said about him. He's been here a long time, and he has written a lot of stuff. And if you look at the building out here, the archives, you'll see David's tracks all over that facility, both in and out. So David, would you come and share with us what you have this morning? While he's coming, I just want to mention one thing. We can talk about this later, but next year, 2025 here, we will be reflecting on the Anabaptists. The theme is From Zurich, Switzerland to the Casselman Valley. And Marcus Yoder, the executive director of the Heritage Center in Berlin, Ohio, will be the presenter. And I say that to encourage you to come and to tell others. That weekend will extend beyond Friday and Saturday into Sunday. And Sunday morning, Marcus will have a combined adult class here, and then he will also bring the sermon on that day. So David, it's yours.
Get myself situated here for a session of reading. It was January 1877. A new schedule was needed for church services. A major change was made in the Casselman Valley. Now the Amish of Springs, Salisbury, and Myersdale did not belong to the same congregation as the Amish of Grantsville, Castleman, Bittinger, and the Forks. Instead of one congregation, there were two. These congregations were not divided by doctrine and polity. Both had the same affiliation, Amish Mennonite, commonly known just as Amish. Both ascribed to the same disciplines in 1877. But now, the Mason-Dixon line divided them geographically. One congregation was known as the Pennsylvania Church, the other as the Maryland Church. And where you lived determined which congregation you belonged to if you were Amish. 100 years had passed since the first Amish arrived in the Cassleman Valley and formed a church. They had settled along the corridor of the Castleman River, first in Pennsylvania. In the decades that followed, the settlement extended south into Maryland, and by the 1870s, they were scattered over a stretch of 30 miles from near Myersdale to beyond Biddinger. And the church had grown in numbers so that it could not be accommodated in a member's home at once. Forming two congregations would provide for space for all and could ease the problems of travel to church meetings held in homes. When two congregations were formed, the Pennsylvania church needed a schedule for meetings, and the Maryland church needed a schedule for meetings. To answer the question, Vo Gainama Indigme, where do we go to church? We are fortunate to have a list of names of Amish families that evidently tells us where the Maryland church met on Sundays of the first 10 months of the new arrangement. I have used this list as a primary document in this research with information from sources such as genealogies, historical papers, especially the Casselman Chronicles, local newspapers accessed through newspapers.com, listings in Ancestry.com, and archival collections. James L. Yoder responded to many questions from me. In addition to documented information, some of the pictures on the slide set come from Jim's collection and camera. I am reminded of an incident when our daughter Janice was a young child and was with Irma and a friend. Janice wanted to satisfy her own curiosity and asked the friend, "What is in your purse?" The lady did not reply specifically, but reached into her purse, pulled out a piece of gum, and gave it to Janice. Irma said to Janice, "It's not nice to ask what is in your purse." Janice responded, "Yes, it is. That way you get things." Well, I kept asking Jim Yoder, and I got things. The slide set that enhances this presentation is produced by Phyllis Swartz, our daughter. I'm grateful for the product of her skills and work. The schedule for church services runs from January 21 to October 24. The dates match every other Sunday on the 1877 calendar. With each date is the name of an Amish family that resided in Maryland. The document is untitled, but given the year, the bi-weekly Sunday dates, and the names of Amish households in Maryland, we may safely treat it as a schedule of homes hosting the church services. I am assuming that in the absence of contrary information, that services were held as scheduled. By identifying the locations of the scheduled homes, we get a picture of the geography. I shall use present-day names of places and roads. 5 clusters come to the fore: Grantsville, Kaiser's Ridge, Castleman Nebo, Biddinger, Foxtown Road. The Grantsville cluster. Here are 6 homes shown by the numbers within 2 miles of where we are meeting now along Dorsey Hotel Road and State Route 669. The Kaiser's Ridge cluster. This is 6 miles west of Grantsville across Negro Mountain, marked by the intersection of US 219 and Interstate 68. The Mount Nebo Castleman cluster. This takes us about 2 miles south of Grantsville as the crow flies. Here, Route 494 495 runs parallel with the Casselman River. Maple Grove Road and Hare Hollow Road lead to Mount Nebo. The Bittinger Cluster. The Bittinger is 8 miles south of Grantsville on State Route 495. The Foxtown Cluster. This is a row of farms along Foxtown Road. This cluster includes the southmost residences of the Amish of the Castleman Valley. The place for church services went from home to home and from cluster to cluster. How were these moves managed? How were the church benches moved from cluster to cluster? Presumably, the benches were transported by team and farm wagon on roads poorly constructed and poorly maintained by today's standards. They moved the benches a considerable distance at times, at least if they had only one set of benches. For example, on March 4, services were scheduled in the home of Rudolph Yoder near Grantsville, that's number 4 on the map. 2 weeks later, the benches were needed 14 miles south at the home of John Brenneman, number 5 on Foxtown Road. How did the hosting families prepare for an upcoming church service? In general Amish practice, when church services are held in homes, a meal is provided after the service. But the church dinners reportedly were discontinued in the Casselman Valley before this time, already in 1873. The church had faced the problem of large numbers of neighborhood coal mine employees arriving just in time for the meal. Managing the food must have been difficult. There were occasions of rowdiness, and on one occasion a broken arm. But in 1877, even without serving dinners, the house and barn needed to be readied when a home was scheduled for church services. Failing to find descriptions of Casselman Valley homes preparing for the event, we turned to sources of current usage in other areas. We learned that the prior week is busy with preparation. It is a time for cleaning the house thoroughly, including windows, walls, and furniture. It's a matter of both self-respect and respect for others. Furniture is moved, and some of it removed to another part of the house or to an outdoor building to make room for the benches. The barn is put into presentable shape and rearranged for keeping and feeding the horses. In some homes, these preparations may run smoothly. In others, the hosting may be stressful, especially in cases of many young children and aged occupants. But where help was needed, others of the congregation may come to the aid of the hosting family. At least some do not see it as drudgery. An Amish homemaker of elsewhere recently wrote, "I love taking church at our house. I've always enjoyed the excitement and bustle of house cleaning, scrubbing porches, window screens, cleaning out corners, preparing food. It's all part of our tradition, and I really enjoy it." But back to the Casselman Valley. We shall follow the list of 21 names and attempt to designate the location of each home. The schedule for January 21 takes us to the home of Moses and Catherine Schrock. This apparently was the first service of the newly organized Maryland Church. It was held in the Foxtown cluster. Moses and Catherine Schrock were in their 23rd year of marriage. Their household consisted of 6 children, ages 2 to 17. Son Daniel is age 15 in the picture, his age when church was held in his home in 1877. The original part of the house, now the home of Ida Reckner, was the home of Moses and Catherine. While this was the first meeting on this schedule, it must have been a familiar experience. Even attendance may have been similar. Because of distance and bad roads, many from Pennsylvania may not have attended services in the Foxtown area in previous years. Moses and Catherine Schrock are buried in the old Cherry Glade Cemetery. For the second meeting, the benches were needed at Grantsville in the home of Moses, Dee, and Caroline Yoder. They lived on Dorsey Hotel Road, 1.5 miles north of Grantsville, less than a half a mile from where we are sitting now. This is the present home of Joseph Yoder. The available route for transporting the benches was present-day Route 495. It was described in those days as horrible and bumpy. The Amish road had not yet been built as an alternate road. The Yoder's children were 4 years, 3 years, and 11 months, too young to help with the preparations. But in the 1880 census, 2 19-year-olds were there, Sevilla Kinsinger, listed as a servant, and Cyrus Schlesnagel. They may have had such help also in 1877. Moses Dee and Caroline Yoder are buried in the Niverton Amish Cemetery. On February 18, the benches were needed at the home of Samuel J. Beachy on Kaiser's Ridge. Samuel and Elizabeth had moved to Kaiser's Ridge in 1865. This house was built in 1845 and later remodeled with a new porch and other modifications. The benches needed to be moved 8 miles from north of Grantsville across Negro Mountain, where the National Road reaches its highest peak east of the Rocky Mountains. The team faced the challenge of ascent with a loaded wagon. After crossing the peak, the wagon brakes would have been a good feature on the west side. The National Road was in bad repair at this time. According to one account, quoting, the road was on a downward course to ruin until it can only be distinguished and identified by its cast iron mileposts and arch bridges. We do not know what the weather conditions were on that February day, but we do know Kaiser's Ridge as a windy place. Not only did the benches need to cross the mountain, but also some of the people had the mountain to cross. Of the clusters we have identified, only Kaiser's Ridge was west of Negro Mountain. So most of the Amish families faced the mountain crossing when church was hosted by the Beaches, and the Beaches faced the same challenge on most occasions of church services. Some of the families may not yet have had a buggy in 1877, so we beg for more information on how families made it to the services. In 1877, the family of Samuel and Elizabeth consisted of 9 children, ages 8 to 26, according to the 1880 census. This family was more mature than some. Sons Christian and David were married. Others of the children were young adults. Noah, in the picture, was age 19 in 1877. During this time, the family was operating 2 farms, that is on Kaiser's Ridge and on the farm east of Grantsville along the river. When working on that farm, some of the older children at times would keep house there temporarily. They knew the challenge of travel to that River Road farm before River Road existed. It was in 1877 that Samuel Beachy and others sent a petition to the county commissioners for a road to be built where River Road now runs off of Route 40. Samuel J. and Elizabeth Beachy are buried in the Otto Amish Cemetery, Arthur, Illinois. For the church meeting of number 4 of the newly organized congregation, we go back to the Grantsville cluster. We go to the home of Rudolph and Barbara Yoder on Dorsey Hotel Road, 1.5 miles north of Grantsville, next to the Yoder School building. They were married 24 years earlier by Bishop Jonas Beachy. This marriage was blessed with one child who died young. Rudolph and Barbara were living alone in the 1880 census, perhaps also in 1877. Rudolph was said to be a successful farmer. Grantsville News in the Republican of September 18, 1858 reports that Rudolph Yoder's wheat yielded 38 bushels per acre. The journalist then asks, who in Garrett can beat that? If I recall correctly, we once had a yield of 32 bushels per acre on my home farm in the 1940s, and we thought that was very good compared to this 38. Their house was quite new, built in 1874, according to the initials on the attic window, 18RY74, R8 Rudolph Yoder, 1874. Rudolph and Barbara are buried in the Narveton Amish Cemetery. For the second Sunday of March, the location changed from the Grantsville cluster to the Foxtown cluster, to the home of John Brenneman. John and Lydia Brenneman's house was located at the present address of Barry and Carol Moss, 307 Foxtown Road. When the schedule was made in January 1877, John and the planners would not have known that John would become a widower in March. His wife Lydia died on February 9, when both John and Lydia were 46 years of age, leaving John with one child, Noah, age 5, and a lad named Henry Musser living in the home. But there was a time when the home bustled with 6 other children born to John and Lydia Brenneman. Due to a diphtheria plague in 1870, they lost the 6 children within a period of 6 months. 6 small graves are part of the cemetery on the Brenneman farm, referred to as Cherry Tree Cemetery in Ancestry.com. The cemetery is visible from the lane that leads to the home of Merlin and Lisa Beitzel. But John and Lydia reached out to others. Henry Musser, now age 11, had been taken into the Brenneman home in 1871 and was there yet in the 1880 census. On June 9, 1877, John Brenneman remarried to Lydia's niece, Mary Beachy, who at times had served as maid in the Brenneman home. It was quite a year for John. Wife Lydia died on February 9. John was scheduled to host the church on March 18. He was ordained deacon on May 14 and married Mary Beachy on June 9. John then served the church as deacon for many years. Mary, John's second wife, later married Emanuel Hirschberger and is buried in the Narveton Amish Cemetery. John and Lydia Brenneman are buried in the family cemetery on the farm. Henry and Mary Miller hosted the congregation on April 1, Easter Day. Bishop Joel Beachy's list, Gemeindeschriften, Scriptures for Church, shows the reading for that day as Matthew 26 and 27, a passage of 141 verses. It includes the passion of Jesus, his trial, his crucifixion. We don't know, and of course the resurrection, and we don't know who read the scripture that day. Maryland did not yet have a deacon. As noted above, John Brenneman was ordained deacon about 6 weeks later. Henry and Mary Miller lived along the National Road, 1/2 mile west of the foot of Negro Mountain on the east slope of Kaiser's Ridge. So again, the benches needed to cross the mountain. Henry and Mary had 9 children, ages 1 to 17. Along with the little ones who needed care, they had 4 teenagers. A maid, Emma Durst, was in the household at census time in 1880, so likely also in 1877. We can imagine a busy household able to accomplish the customary preparations for hosting the church. Mary was age 38 when the church met in her house. Here she poses in older age. Mary's obituary writer states, "She was a kindly, cheerful disposition and took a keen interest in the welfare of the church and community." But a tragedy occurred that year. A one-liner in the Beachy genealogy states, "Henry unfortunately had his left arm taken off by being caught in a threshing machine 1877. So his left arm was gone. Was Henry right-handed? Did he lose his dexterity? The Beachy book does not reveal his handedness, but a later news item describes Henry as accomplishing more work with one arm than most men do with 2. We do not know what kind of threshing machine Henry was operating. It seems too early for steam or gasoline power, but even a thresher run by horses in a circular hitch needed some fast-moving parts to thresh the grain. Henry and Mary Miller are buried in the Narveton Amish Cemetery. 2 weeks later, 2 weeks after Easter Day, the church service, the benches were needed back at Grantsville. Emmanuel and Mary Hirschberger lived less than a mile north of Grantsville on present-day State Route 669 on the former Olin Schrock farm. In 1877, Emmanuel and Mary had 4 children, ranging in age from 1 to 12 years. This would have called for help in preparation for the church service. Sarah Ringer was in the household in the 1880 census. She perhaps was their maid in 1877. The Hirschbergers were faithful church attenders. When they lived in the Cove, closer to Accident, they traveled regularly to church, even with that distance. But they moved to Grantsville to be closer to many of the church services. Emmanuel was careful to observe Sunday as a Sabbath. Once, when en route to church in a carriage, they met a man from whom Emmanuel bought pigs at times. The man told Emmanuel that he had a new litter of pigs available and asked how many he wanted. Emmanuel replied, "This is Sunday. I can't tell you today. Tomorrow morning I'll mail you a letter and tell you how much. No, I won't ask today. I'll find out tomorrow." Emmanuel and Mary Hirschberger are buried in the Narveton Amish Cemetery. April 29, the benches go on that horrible and bumpy road from Grantsville to Bittinger to the home of Jacob and Catherine Ingle Brenneman. Jacob was a minister in the Amish church, and according to historian Charles E. Hoy, stood well in his denomination. Jacob may have preached either the first sermon, of perhaps 30 minutes, or the main sermon of perhaps an hour. Catherine's parents, that is, John and Salome Sterner Engel, were active in the Reformed Church. Her father promoted the temperance movement at a time when some of the Amish farmers were running distilleries. As owner of Engel's Mill, so the story goes, a young Amish employee, Jacob Brenneman, was attracted to the owner's daughter, Catherine. Jacob and Catherine were married, likely in 1829, when she was 17 or perhaps 18. This couple was a long-time pillar in the Amish church. Jacob and Catherine were seniors in 1877. They had 14 children. 2 died in infancy. Now only the youngest son, Elias, age 18, lived at home. Son Peter, age 22, may have been in Iowa, where he married Lydia Miller in December of that year. On this Sunday, April 29, this Brenneman family didn't know what's coming. Daughter Elizabeth, wife of Elias A. Yoder, died in December 1877. 3 years later, 1880, Jacob died, and Mother Catherine went to live with son Joel and family. In the same year, son Elias was no longer at home, but was working for his brother-in-law, Elias Yoder, near Summit Mills. 5 years later, son Peter was ordained as minister in Iowa. I have not determined the place of burial of Jacob and Catherine Brenneman. Next, we go from Biddinger to Foxtown Road, where a church building, Cherry Glade, would be constructed 4 years later. But in 1877, the home of John and Sarah Tice was scheduled for May 13. The question that morning, who would be the new deacon for the Maryland church? Their deacon, before forming a separate congregation, was Elias Hirschberger, who lived in Pennsylvania. On this day, the lot fell on John Brenneman. He was a widower, but not for long. 4 weeks later, he married Mary Beachy on June 9. John Tice, host of this day, was an immigrant. He arrived in Baltimore as a baby in 1833. The oceanic trip was a long one. The winds were contrary. What might have taken 6 weeks took 14 weeks. That is more than 3 months. 2 expectant mothers gave birth during the voyage. John Tice and a Kinsinger boy were born at sea. The Kinsinger mother died, and John Tice's mother nursed and cared for little Jacob along with her own baby, John. This story exemplifies the bravery involved in ocean travel in those days. The sail ships depended on the wind. In a typical voyage, space was crowded. Food was scarce and old. Water was dirty. Seasickness was common. Diseases were rampant. Deaths occurred with burial at sea. In 1877, the Amish people of Cassleman Valley remembered those stories. These were personal experiences of those parents and grandparents. 44 years after baby John Tice arrived in America, the Amish church went to church in the home of John and Sarah Tice. Sarah also was known as Sal. Sal was known for exceptional energy and industry. One story among others is told by a granddaughter, Tilly Tice Yoder. One Sunday morning, when her brothers and sisters were not home, Sal milked 20 cows and then walked to church, which was 11.5 miles. Tilly then adds, It almost seems that this story must be a mistake, but she told it a number of times and to a number of people. Having been told by Tilly Yoder, I consider the source reliable. I remember Tilly as my childhood Sunday school teachers, one of them. Likely, Sal Tice took in stride the preparations for church service when held in her home. But 4 years later, preparing to host the church was no longer necessary when the original cherry-glade meeting house was built on their farm. John and Sarah Tice are buried in the family cemetery on their farm on Foxtown Road. On May 27, the place of Amish worship moved from the Foxtown cluster back to Grantsville to the home of Joel J. and Sevilla Miller. This household was a mixture of people. Joel and Sevilla were aged 32 and 31. Daughter Elizabeth may have been his, I missed a page here, didn't I? They had 3 small children, Jonas, Mary, and Louis, aged 6, 3, and 1. Also, Sevilla's mother, Magdalena Falk, age 52, was living with them, as well as Sevilla's 24-year-old half-brother, Christian Vogt. Joel and Sevilla lived on Dorsey Hotel Road on the first farm north of Grantsville. In the earlier years of their marriage, while constructing the farm buildings, the family lived in the Cassleman Hotel in Grantsville, owned by Joel's father, Joel B. Miller. But they were well settled on the farm in 1877. We can only guess where the service was held on that late spring day, in the house or in the barn. Both buildings were new. The house was 3 years old. Joel was destined to serve the church as minister and bishop, but not yet. He was ordained as minister 3 years later in 1880. Joel and Sevilla Miller are buried in the Maple Glen Cemetery. Elias and Lydia Orendorff lived at the Bittinger Crossroads along Laguerre Road. 2 years earlier, they had bought 200 acres where the foundation of the house lies in ruins. They would not have known when they were in their upper 20s in 1877 that they would move to Greenwood, Delaware in 1817, where 2 of their children lived. Elias and Lydia died in 1920 of the infirmities of old age within 48 hours of each other. But in 1877, they were a young married couple with 7 young children, the oldest age 11 and the youngest 4 months. The censuses of 1870 and 1880 do not list hired help in that home. If this was the case in 1877, we hope some Amish neighbors helped them prepare for the church meeting. They apparently were glad to host the church. An acquaintance reported that Elias was strongly Amish. Elias and Lydia Orndorff are buried in the Mennonite Cemetery in Greenwood, Delaware. Jonas Beachy, the senior bishop, was scheduled to host the church on June 24. He had served in that office for more than 40 years. But by this time, the younger bishop, Joel Beachy, was serving as bishop. Jonas was 85 years of age now, a widower for 2 years. Daughter Elizabeth may have been his housekeeper, as suggested by the 1870 census. He lived on Kaiser's Ridge, next to his son Samuel J. Beachy. Some of Samuel's family were young adults who likely helped their grandfather in hosting the church. Jonas and Sarah Beachy are buried in the family cemetery on their farm in the low area below the ramp that leads from US 219 to Interstate 68. once again the church meeting crossed the mountain. This time, the Amish met in the Cassleman Mount Nebo cluster, just off present-day 495, near the fork where the two branches of the Casselman River merge. Here was the home of Moses and Sarah Kemp. Of their 8 children, only 5 lived at home in 1880, namely Samuel, 24, Mary, 16, Amanda, 14, Catherine, 11, and Linus, 6. Not included in the census of 1880 were Lydia, 22, Annie, 21, Susanna, 19. With a row of 6 girls between 2 boys, it's an easy guess that 3 girls aged 19 to 22 were hired out as maids in other Amish homes. Samuel would have been needed on the farm. Some of the Kemp children married soon after 1880, but not yet. Moses Kemp's farm was known as Shadyside Farm. Moses and Sarah lived in the older of the 2 houses, a log house. Is that where the church met? Or did they meet in the barn, which was newer? In addition to hosting the Amish church service, this family was involved in a neighborhood Sunday school. The Lutherans conducted a Ridgely Sunday school in those days, and the Mennonites had Sunday school in the Ridgely Schoolhouse, about 3 miles south of Grantsville. It is unclear whether these 2 Ridgely schools were united, simultaneous, or in succession. But we know that Moses Kemp attended a large Sunday school. Get my place here. Well, now, where was I? I think my pages are in right order. I guess that video is still rolling, isn't it? Let's see, where was I? There's Elias, Jonas, Beachy. All right. Here we go. We know that Moses Kemp attended a large Sunday school convention in the Lutheran Church in Oakland with Henry Winterberg, the Lutheran superintendent of the Ridgely Sunday School. The convention extended from Friday afternoon to Sunday evening. 32 teachers and others gave reports. Moses and Sarah Kemp are buried in the Maple Glen Cemetery. And that brings us to the conclusion of reading number 1. And this brings us also then to a question and answer period. And your comments are certainly welcome, your additions of information or corrections. And we'll have Ken come up here to field the questions because it's likely I can't hear what you're saying. And the microphone's ready to come to you if you will raise your hand.
While we're waiting for others, you mentioned the gentleman whose name I forget. His wife died in February and he remarried in June. If that would happen today, I think most of us would look a little wide-eyed at that. It's a little hasty, maybe, we would say. But do you know, was that kind of prompt remarriage common in those days, or would that have been uncommon even back then?
Mm-hmm. It is my impression that consider the situation of a man with young children in those days, where you didn't have microwaves in the kitchen and all these other conveniences that we have now, the difficulty of both supporting and caring for for a family of young children. And I think it was not an unusual thing for a widower, for example, to even go to other churches knowingly seeking for a wife. And I've also wondered whether between the time of John's, see, we're talking about John Brenneman, I believe, I think I'm the right one, of his losing his first wife, and then he was ordained as deacon. And I wonder if there was some idea that deacon really needs a wife to deacon well. And maybe that had something to do with it. But I think maybe it was not a real unusual thing and not thought inappropriate at that time. Anybody else have comments on that question?
In this long, arduous journey that you took, David, I wonder what was one thing that surprised you most? Was there a big surprise or an interesting surprise that came in this study?
Well, that's kind of a difficult question, so far as the most is concerned, especially. But one of the things that really comes to the fore is infant mortality. So many families lost a child or two or more, and especially if a plague took place. The Brenneman family is one example of losing 6 children in one summer there. And that's one kind of thing that really stood out to me. Another thing that I wondered about as I got into this study was how did they schedule church services? I expected that if they had a church service on Foxtown Road one Sunday, they'd probably go to the next door neighbor for the next and so on. But instead, they really went back and forth, not only from home to home, but cluster to cluster also. And I think that was in consideration of sharing the burden of travel and going to the extra work of moving those benches. Now, one thing I don't know, I'm assuming they had only one set of benches. Maybe they had one set at Foxtown and another one at Grantsville or north and south. I don't, those are things we don't know. And I have built some assumptions into this entire paper of things. For example, I don't have a record that they always met were scheduled. I'm assuming they did, unless I have information to the contrary. And I built a story on that assumption. I think that's fair enough if it's understood that it's built on that assumption. But I was interested in their going not only from home to home, but also cluster to cluster in most cases. Only one case that I can think of now that they stayed within a cluster from one Sunday to the next. I also noticed that the cluster feature. It really, well, after I identified these places, how did I identify these places? Well, you can go to land deeds and see where people owned land, where they owned their farms. You could go to the stories that you found in the Cassleman Chronicle. You can go to especially the census, where you can pretty well figure out who lived by whom and so on. And then the genealogies also. And a lot of these places are still within a family, many are not. So after seeing where these people lived, where these meetings went, the clusters really stood out, which is also, I think, an Amish and Mennonite kind of tendency to not only have a community in the Casselman Valley, but even within that valley, things were somewhat clustered then. It's not only Amish and Mennonite who did it. The Lutherans, for example, they had quite a cluster up in the Accident Forks area. Out there in Ohio where we live, there's quite a Lutheran cluster close by us there. So that's another thing that stood out. Well, those are things, a few things that just come to my mind right now. Other comments?
I was just thinking a little bit about how people communicated at that point. The horses, did they walk? How did they communicate back and forth?
Well, I think in 1877, we are almost in the pre-buggy days for these people. I don't have it quite identified just when the buggies come around. If you look at the newspaper ads at that time, the buggies were not a big thing yet. And also, a buggy might not always have been a lot of fun on the kind of roads they had at that time. So up almost to this time, if you went somewhere, you went on foot or you rode a horse, one or the other was the most common thing. You could also, I guess, get on they did have farm wagons earlier. We know that the wheel was invented many centuries before this, but a bumpy farm wagon on a bumpy road wasn't a lot of fun to travel with either. So that was a major way of travel. And they had their saddles too. I don't know how much was bareback. The side saddle was a common feature for women to ride on. They're still in the antiques of the area. There are some side saddles I remember having seen and so on. But I haven't quite figured out just when the buggy came along, but I don't think it arrived yet in common use in 1877.
I hadn't thought of this before, but all these funerals, where did they have them?
Where did they have the funerals? I think they were in the home of the deceased. I don't have specific information on that. There's one case here that I can cite where, well, no, I'm not sure if I can document this now or go back to documentation. But especially at a time when church services were held in the homes, where else would you go for a funeral except in the home of the deceased? I think that was the most likely thing.
David, depending which area the church service was held, were the participants primarily from that area, or did they travel from north to, if it was in this southern area, were there participants in the worship area from the north also, or?
It is my thinking that before 1881, when they had church houses, no, I'd rather say before 1877, when there's only one congregation, Biddinger to Myersdale, it's my thinking that most Pennsylvanians, for example, did not get to church services south of here very much. It was too far for most. Some might have braved it. There might have been special reasons to go. Then after the division of having, this division of two congregations now in 1877, I don't have clear record on that. I'm not sure that, I don't know how much the Grantsville people got to Foxtown Road. That may be another reason for moving cluster to cluster, so that you don't have so much, not only distance of travel, but absenteeism also. It occurs to me that might have reduced. If you lived over by this Pennsylvania line, just north of here, a mile or two, and the church was at Foxtown. Then if they'd have kept at Foxtown for Sunday after Sunday, you might have deprived the Grantsville people of making it to church, especially the women and the children. Sometimes there were situations where the men and the boys got to church more frequently than the women did because of difficulty of travel.
I was wondering, in your research, did you run across travel in two-wheel carts?
No, I did not. That doesn't say they didn't have them, but I didn't run into anything like that. And thinking of the auction sales and the inventories of estates and so on, I just don't remember coming across that.
Sorry.
I've been told that when buggies first came out or became more prevalent, they were looked on as something for pleasure, to go pleasure riding in, and the question came up, are the Amish, are we going to have buggies? Are we going to allow them? Mm-hmm. And then there was a lady that she had, as I remembered, she had some kind of handicap, and well, it will help her get to church. And then it was decided that, if it helps people get to church better, then we can have them. And then they eventually became accepted. That's what I've been told.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting story, and I can believe that could have happened. I haven't run into that in my research, but it could well be that it's something that has not quite happened. You would think that that would be an Amish question, though. And yet at that time, in the Amish experience, you didn't have as much of a separation on such things as farm implements and house appliances. The distinction just wasn't that great. The big distinction between Amish and general society was decorations, I think. Being fancy meant being proud, for example. But a simple buggy, I can see, and your farm implements, until the rubber tires came along and some things like that. Well, I guess in some areas, being Amish raised the question even having tractors on the field. I'm not aware that for the Amish here that it ever was a serious issue whether or not to have a tractor on the field. And as you can see, they use them now a great deal, but not for everything. Still like to use the horses for certain things, I believe. But I appreciate that story, that may be true.
Thinking a little bit more about the logistics of the benches and really how many families attended, and we don't really know that, I guess, whether it was organized by clusters and it was moved from one cluster to the other, and whether benches stayed in the neighborhood. But logistically, I mean, talking about having roads that were difficult for even a buggy to go and moving them in a wagon, how many benches in a large wagon load? And then also the question about whether if they were scheduled in advance enough, I assume that they went somewhere knowing that the service was where it was going to be next time, and take the benches home with them, Or if they weren't allowed to talk about how many piglets, were they allowed to take the benches home with them on Sunday? Also, I wondered if whether there were any formal interactions, church interactions between the Pennsylvania group and the Maryland group on a yearly basis or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, on your last question, I don't think there was anything happening on a yearly basis, but they were very interactive with each other between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And I don't think either the Maryland church or the Pennsylvania church would have taken any drastic move away from a given odding or tradition without the other. That is demonstrated by the fact that when they got the songbooks, they got the songbooks maybe before they had the two congregations. When it came to building church houses, they voted. They had a Maryland vote, they had a Pennsylvania vote, and I don't know what they would have done if the Pennsylvania church, for example, would have strongly said no and the Maryland church would have strongly said yes. But they were putting these things together, one with the other, and they cooperated very closely, I believe, until the 1895 division then, and that is where a very definite division happened then, and that kind of interaction was broken off in 1895. And there were things that happened from this time of 1877 up until 1895 that finally led to that division, and that's a subject for another year then. Well, thank you for the comment.
This brings us to break time. We'll do a 10-minute break according to the schedule, and we will also lift an offering. So while we're breaking, Bernard, grab their billfolds.